I'm really excited to be here, and I want to start out actually with a bit of a story, and it has something to do with how I first met Phil. So I am from the U.S., as you probably tell. I moved to the U.K. about 5 years ago, and I had the chance to bring an American brand to England. We had no money. The brand was called Method. Have any of you heard of Method? A few of you, that's great. So it's a cleaning brand, which may not make you feel kind of excited about a cleaning brand, but Method tried to do it in a very non-traditional way. The problem was we had absolutely no money to speak of, and so we were completely bootstrapping it. So we arrived in England, no money, trying to build a brand, and we realized that for the price of a Tesco promotion, we could get a booth at the Ideal Home Show for 25 days. And we thought about the pros and cons and thought, if we're in Tesco, we're going to completely get lost in the clutter with everybody else running a promotion. But if we go to the Ideal Home Show, maybe we can really break through and do something impressive. And so we decided to do that. And we didn't have any money to build a proper booth and have events, people come and set up the booth for us. So we did it ourselves. We were just starting the office, so we actually got all of our furniture at IKEA, set it up at the Ideal Home Show, and then that furniture became our furniture in the office, which was wonderful because then you could put it in capital expenditures and write it off over 3 years. So we did that. And we ended up having this amazing presence at the Ideal Home Show. We ended up building a miniature Method home. We had a bathtub filled with products. We had stuff on the walls. We had AstroTurf on the floor. You walk into this space and you felt, this is a brand I'm really excited about, and they're selling tub and tile cleaner. That was what we were all about. But what struck me as we were pulling this off were a couple things. One, nobody in this photo of setting up the Ideal Home Show has a traditional marketing background except for myself. We have somebody from accounting, supply chain management, somebody from a sales background, and the guy in the bottom right didn't even work at Method. He worked at MASH, which was an affiliate of Dylan. That's how I first met Phil and Jules. We were talking about the fact that we're doing this Ideal Home Show thing, and because this was effectively the entire company, the entire brand in England, we couldn't send everybody there over the course of 25 days to tell everybody about Method. So we talked to these guys, and they were unlike a lot of other groups that we had talked to because they thought very deliberately about the talent they were bringing in to represent brands. And as it turned out, Tom was a great example of this. He led a team of people who were not Method, but over the course of the 25 days, everybody really thought that they were because they spoke the brand as well as any of us could have. And it struck me as I was at the Ideal Home Show in this amazing space with this amazing presence and looked across the hall and I saw somebody sampling Persil, and they're basically as quickly as they could stuffing Persil samples in people's bags as they walked by, that there was something to this that with no marketing budget to speak of, the way we were marketing was more important than the budget that we had to market. And we ultimately, where we sold product on the show as well, we ultimately got people so excited about the brand, all the people coming through the Ideal Home Show, they were buying products and carrying full bottles of cleaning products home with them from the Ideal Home Show from Earl's Court. We made enough from sales to actually pay for the show. And so it was a marketing event that not only was little money, it ended up being no money. And that's where I want to start off talking about today, because I think that that talent and how you recruit and who represents your brand is inextricably linked with marketing. And so the two go hand in hand, and it's crucial. And it's why I've thought of this talk as the HR director is the new marketing director, because the talent that you bring into the door and how you bring that talent into the door and why they want to come to your door is just as crucial as anything you might do with a pure marketing hat on. And I think there are ultimately two distinct philosophies about that. There's the philosophy that if you just keep adding more water to what you're doing, that's how you get your brand and your marketing out there. And there's a philosophy that you can actually change and think about what you're doing in an entirely different way. And it applies to marketing, it applies to everything that you do, but it particularly applies to talent and recruitment. So I want to give a bit of background on me and why I'm standing up here. So this is a bit of the point of view that I have on the world. So my background is classic FMCG consumer marketing, predominantly. But I also happen to draw cartoons. And surprisingly, I've never been fired for some of them, although I occasionally try to rattle the cages a little bit. But I started out at General Mills and Nestle, so large organizations building brands. And while at General Mills, I came across this little brand called Method. I was in Minneapolis, and this brand suddenly popped up in my local Target store. And this was a bottle of washing up liquid that was like unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was about this tall. It looked like a bowling pin. You squirt the soap out from the bottom. And I thought, what are these guys doing? It's so different. And we could never get anything like this through the doors at General Mills. I just knew it. And as I studied the story further, I realized that not only were they doing things in a different way, but they were a couple of guys working out of a Victorian house in San Francisco. And I was part of a brand team that had this immense R&D center and facility, but we weren't able to take products into the market that were actually disruptively different. I was really inspired by this. This ultimately was my cover letter. I realized that one of the founders of Method had signed up to get my weekly marketing cartoon. So I drew this, inspired by that famous ad from 1984 when the Apple first launched the Mac, and they were representing IBM Big Blue as Big Brother. And I sent this to them with my CV, and I ended up working at Method, and had an amazing 5 years with Method, helping grow the brand from really small to $100 million in sales. And it had an incredible impact on me. I left there in November, and I'm now cartooning full-time, but it shaped the way I look at marketing. And so today I want to talk about marketing. I'm going to use cartoons instead of bullet points to sort of tell the story, some of my thinking on marketing and how my experience at Method has shaped the way that I market. Because I believe that it's a very powerful story, whether you're David competing against Goliath or you're David within Goliath. The same principles apply, and if you think about marketing in certain ways, it'll make what you do that much more effective. If you happen to have the benefit of marketing dollars, it'll just make that go stronger. But if you have no marketing dollars to speak of, you still have a fighting chance and can go from a couple of guys in a house making cleaning products in their bathtub to $100 million in sales. So why this is possible is that Don Draper is no longer in charge. So the marketing world, as we all know, is evolving very quickly. And it's a lot of fun to watch Mad Men and see how things were done in the 60s. But I think in a lot of ways, there's a sense of marketing, a legacy of marketing that still works this way. You still assume that there's a guy like Don Draper who says what your brand stands for, and then you just put marketing behind that and put that out to the world. It's described sometimes, Seth Godin described it as the TV industrial complex. That you have sort of a formula where you buy ads around one message, you use that to get more distribution, you sell more products, you make a profit. And it's this command and control style where there's sort of one campaign concept. You say what your brand stands for once, and then you sort of put that out into the world. But the problem is that it's entirely evolved and changed from the snake oil salesman and the TV ad men of traditional marketing to where the consumer is ultimately in charge of what your brand stands for. And she discovers your brand. She says what your brand stands for, not the brand manager. And her worldview is no longer shaped by a couple of media channels. You're no longer restricted to just a few different ways that you can get your brand story out there. Her world looks more like this. So Don Draper doesn't work in this world. You have a million different touch points of what your brand stands for. And every little interaction around the fringes, that's where the power is, and that's what people remember. They don't remember the 30-second spot. They remember the bad customer service experience. That's what they remember. And it completely recasts it because it's not Don Draper. Ultimately, everybody in an organization has the ability to impact the brand and impact what that brand stands for. Everybody in an organization. And it flips organizations inside out. So that anybody who's brought onto a business should not only know their functional job description, but should be potential brand ambassadors, because you never know when you're going to need them to. It calls into question how you even think about marketing, because typically marketing kind of works on the fringes. You have a lot happening inside the business, but marketing works on the fringes. This calls it into question, I think, where ultimately you have to think about your brand theory. You're much, much deeper than just your next fiscal year marketing plan. It's a lot deeper than that. The brands that Phil talked a minute ago that have a strong sense of purpose, that people want to be a part of those brands. I went to the Innocent Fruit Towers yesterday to have lunch with their head of creative, and you walk in there, and it's coming out of every pore. The brand stands for much more than whatever they might show you as their 2013 marketing plan. It's much, much deeper. And a lot of that relates to culture and talent. So I want to walk through a couple of things today. I want to share a little bit of the story about how Method got from a couple of guys working in their house to something much bigger, and the talent decisions they made along the way. And then I want to use a couple of cartoons to talk about something, hopefully ways to hold up as a bit of a mirror to organizations you may be familiar with, on how ultimately there needs to be a bit of a shift in how we think about marketing and how we think about talent. So these are the guys who are the founders of Method. They're Eric and Adam. They started Method out of this house in San Francisco. There were two roommates living with a bunch of other guys. And for some reason, in the late 90s, they wanted to be entrepreneurial, and they looked around them and decided it would be fun to create a cleaning company. So it's not exactly what you think about when you think about San Francisco Bay Area, particularly 1999, entrepreneurial guys who want to start a soap company. But they did. So Eric on the right came at it from a slightly different way. None of these guys had marketing backgrounds to speak of. None of them had worked in traditional FMCG backgrounds. Eric was probably closest. He came from a design background, had done a little bit of brand strategy work. Adam on the left had been an environmental scientist who did a bit of work on the Kyoto Protocol, but none of them went through any sort of Unilever training. But they looked at the category and they thought, there might be some opportunity here. Now, you wouldn't look at this. Like, you go down your local Tesco and you walk in this aisle and it doesn't fire you up the potential that's in this category. Most people go through it actually pretty quickly. But Eric and Adam looked at this and they saw this category and they thought nothing here has changed in the last 50 years. I mean, this category was born out of Don Draper's era. Nothing in this category had changed. They looked at this category and said, it's just kind of a big sea of sameness. It all looks exactly the same. And there are brands that are broken up completely just by problem solution. I have dirty windows, I go over here. I have dirty tiles, I go over here. But there's no brand to speak of here. And as they looked at it with their different perspectives, Eric thought, what a horrible shame that we live in home environments that we really care about. And the products that we use to care for our homes are so ugly, you have to hide them under the kitchen sink. Why does it have to be? And Adam looked at the same category and he thought, well, if we clean technically to make our homes healthier, why are we cleaning with so many registered pesticides? So they looked at it with those two lenses and decided to take a different approach. They started making cleaning products in their bathtub at home. They didn't have any leads or any sales team to speak of. They finally ultimately made their first sale at a small grocery store called Molly Stone's. That's Adam. He went into Molly Stone's and cornered the store manager, and the store manager said, actually, yeah, I'd be willing to take a shot on you, but you have to have product here this afternoon by 3 o'clock. And the problem was they didn't actually have any product. They just had samples. And so they said, well, OK, we have to have it by 3 o'clock. So they immediately went up to San Francisco, started calling all their friends on their mobile phones and asking if they could come by their offices to pick up their house keys, to go to their apartments, to take their half-filled prototypes, take all the prototypes back to their apartment, top off the cleaning products in their bathtub with a little bit of extra solution, seal it off, put it in a wine crate, and take it down to Molly Stone's by 3 o'clock. And the result is the bottom right over here, where they printed off point of sale on their laser printer. They had themselves as some of the models. Some of the hands there are all Adam's hands. The woman coming out of the shower was Eric's ex-girlfriend, which is not a popular topic with his wife. And to make the order, they had to go down the stationery aisle and pick up a diner receipt slip to take the order into the shop. But by that afternoon, they had a full shelf at the local regional grocery store. And everything just kind of worked like that. They figured out stuff as they went. And they didn't look at any barrier in the way as a reason to stop, but instead as a challenge that they would have to overcome some way. Their logistics evolved over time from the back of their car. Their marketing evolved. I don't know why Eric is sampling in the liquor aisle, but it gives you an idea that these guys really didn't know what they were doing. But the thing is, that was actually an advantage because they were looking at a category that hadn't been looked at with fresh eyes for a really, really, really long time. And ultimately, it started to catch hold and people really responded to it. Ultimately, they expanded into a range that, while cleaning products, was something actually pretty aspirational that people got excited about. And ultimately spread beyond just the two of them. Ultimately grew to about 100 people. And the big question is, when you go beyond Eric and Adam, how do you think about the people you bring onto the business? And how do you think about bringing them on in a way that they're as excited to be a brand ambassador as two guys who started the company? And I had the great fortune of joining Method when there were 15 people. When we had the opportunity to move to England, they sent me over here as sort of the one American. They called me the sourdough starter to try to bring the culture along. And this is on Richmond High Street soon after we opened our office here. And we had to go to a sampling at Waitrose, and we found out at the last minute that we had to bring our own table. So we took our printer off that table, and we did an impromptu parade down Richmond High Street on the way down to Waitrose. With the three guys on the business at the time, logistics, marketing, and sales. That was kind of it. But the thing is, although none of us, very few of us had a marketing background, we all saw ourselves as working in marketing. And every step of the way when we added more people into the business, in San Francisco and in London and in other places around the world, we thought a lot about talent because that was the one thing that we had that could potentially be a competitive advantage. We had us, and we had Purcell, the samplers, putting things in bags as quickly as possible. So we focused on the talent. And we thought about what we were up against. Because, we're not going after small competitors here. We were going after every single player in this space all at the same time. Almost $3 billion in advertising spent. And ours was about $3 million. Total drop in the bucket. If you've ever been part of a brand team, $3 million barely pays for anything. We actually, for fun, we looked and realized, we calculated very scientifically that we estimated that all these different companies in aggregate went through 11 million rolls of employee loo paper a year, which meant that they spent 5 times our marketing budget just on toilet paper. And that forced us to think about things very differently because we realized that we couldn't compete in the traditional ways. There's a great quote from the founder of Geek Squad that advertising is a tax you pay on unremarkable thinking. And it forced us to flip it around. In one way, it made us feel better because we just felt undertaxed. But in another way, it forced us to think about everything that we did as something that had the potential to be remarkable directly to a consumer, touching them directly. And it forced a shift in thinking about everyone we brought onto the business who could therefore touch every individual part of the chain differently. We thought about that. And we realized that the only way we were ever going to win in this world is if we found ourselves in a situation where consumers who are surrounded by marketing clutter from everybody else will say, I'll have what she's having. That was the only way we had a shot. And it shaped how we marketed ultimately. So when you are David against Goliath, as we were, we thought about, well, what's our slingshot? And I think that's something relevant to everybody in this room. And I would argue that the slingshot anybody has, any business has, is culture. It's people, it's environment, it's HR. It's all of the things that aren't classically thought of as marketing. And sometimes those types of decisions aren't even made in the same room as the marketing decisions. It's sometimes completely decoupled. I would argue that talent is the biggest slingshot you have when you're David competing against Goliath or David competing within Goliath. And there are a couple different aspects of that I'm going to talk about. Phil started off talking about purpose, talking about Starbucks, talking about how brands that have a real sense of identity, how people gravitate to those. But ultimately, a lot of brands talk about purpose, and a lot of businesses talk about mission. And you go into businesses and you often see things framed on the wall or in a statue in the front foyer. And often it looks like some version of this, where it's so generic you can't actually possibly tell what company it was if you'd seen it somewhere else. It has no meaning inside it. It has no grit inside it. And there are actually websites that you can go to that matches up all of the mission statements of the Fortune 500 companies. And if you were to take away the name, you would not be able to tell what company it was. But it's such a missed opportunity because if people really feel purpose behind what you're doing, you'll not only have employees wanting to join what you're all about, but consumers will as well. So we thought a lot about purpose. We thought a lot about purpose. We thought about purpose more than we thought about brand promise. A lot of brands talk about, we're going to deliver this. But we really stood about the purpose behind it. And we put it in words as people against dirty, which in some ways is generic. In some ways is general. But in other ways means that we're more about just cleaning windows or cleaning tile surfaces. We're about a whole way of life that's doing things differently, against toxic chemicals, against all sorts of things. And you start to feel that there's a movement around this people against dirty. And pretty soon we realized that employees were really resonating with us. And consumers were too, and we had every bottle, it would say, made by and for people against dirty. The purpose was at the center of everything that we did. And when we talked about what the brand stood for, it was no longer a case of what happens in some companies where you write a brand architecture and it's completely unintelligible to anybody outside of marketing. If you took most brand architectures and walked into a factory and gave it to somebody and said, this is what our brand stands for, they kind of laugh at you and they wouldn't understand it. Marketing people like to talk to themselves. But we thought a lot about the brand all the way through, and we wanted the brand to resonate with everybody who could possibly touch it. And so we created all these different books that would put it together, things that were visual and things that were impactful and things that described the brand in a way that anybody could understand. And it meant that no matter who you talked to in the organization, they could represent the brand well. And we invested in that. We didn't have marketing budget, but we invested in this. And it shaped how people thought about the category, because anytime you walk into a new business, the first thing they do is give you a binder about the category. It's the category knowledge. And you realize there are all these established truths about the category. And often, I imagine if you were to go into Unilever or Procter & Gamble or S.C. Johnson, and you take your first day on the job as a brand manager, they give you this category binder and they say, the cleaning category is all about this. And one of the first things they tell you is that it's low interest. So why bother? It's low interest, so we're going to do trade promotions. It's low interest, so we're going to be focused on price. It's low interest, so it's going to shape everything that we do from a low interest lens. And we try to flip that around, that it's not low interest, it's the worldview that's low interest. And actually, if you take something, if you flip it around and think about your brand representing this, that can actually pull people in. And we found that was our breakthrough. So a insight for us was looking at Nike and realizing if Nike were to take the cleaning products traditional worldview and somebody were joining the first day at Nike and somebody said, jogging a lot of people see as a chore, and this brand stands for the ability to make that chore less arduous, that brand wouldn't stand for what it does today. So we wanted to take a positive lens. It's what Adam Morgan refers to as a lighthouse brand. We didn't want to navigate around our consumers. We wanted consumers to navigate around us because they felt so powerful about what we stood for and what we represented. We were building a lighthouse. And the center point of that lighthouse was the culture, that everybody inside the culture felt the same way. So we thought about it through those lens. And ultimately, it made a lot of other things possible. So Method was created before Facebook, before social media. But at the very DNA, because Method was thinking about it this way, Method was a social brand. And I think often what happens is, in particularly the last few years, there are a lot of antisocial brands developing a social media strategy, and it doesn't quite gel together. And the step back I think that needs to happen is think about not how do you develop a social media strategy, but how do you stop becoming an antisocial brand? A lot of that is around purpose. Having a social mission enables you to have social media, I believe. And that opened it up for us because everyone who writes on Facebook and Twitter is a copywriter. Everyone in the traditional world of Don Draper's world, it would have been carefully edited and scripted. But that's no longer possible today. Not only because you have to bring in a lot more people to manage something like this, but often the people posting aren't even your employees. And so you therefore have to have a strong sense of identity so that anybody who stitches and adds to your brand is coming from a strong sense and it's additive, not detractive. What made that possible too was a real sense of who we were talking to. Because we all talk about target markets, and we used to have this joke when I worked at General Mills. The chief marketing officer once said that he saw all these briefs come across his desk, and it was as if it was written that our target was a woman 18 to 49 with a pulse. Every one. And how do you create for a woman with a pulse? And I think a lot of brands do that because you think that mass market means that you have to have a mass target and you have to appeal to everybody. And we tried to flip that around and actually stand for a very tightly prescribed sense of a person. We made it very tight. And that enabled us to talk to that person like they're a friend. It enabled us to make decisions like the one I explained at the Ideal Home Show, or a decision that we made early on when we realized that for the price of a billboard ad, we could rent a store and outfit the store like our brand. And while you might not get as many people coming through that store as who would see that billboard ad, if you walked in this store, you couldn't help but see what the brand stood for. If you were outside on the street looking at a billboard ad, you could ignore it. We thought about the people coming into that store as being just like us. And often when they were in that store, you couldn't tell who was who because it was the same types of people, much like the experience I mentioned at the beginning with the Ideal Home Show, and who was Method and who was MASH. It fled into each other. And it was because people in that store were people against dirty. Whether or not they worked for Method or whether or not they were consumers, they were people against dirty. People following us from afar kind of took the same view. We realized there was this guy named Nathan who had started an entire blog on nothing except for Method. One man's unsuppressed lust for all things Method. So he started this blog a few years ago, and he updates it at least 4 times a week. It's nothing but Method, and we don't know him. Sometimes it gets a bit creepy, but we don't know him. But what it shows is that when you're talking to a guy like Nathan, and he buys into what your brand's all about, imagine paying somebody to write about your brand 3 times a week for a year, and the marketing expense behind that. If instead you stand for something and somebody volunteers to do that, it's incredibly powerful. And one of his favorite things to write about are profiles of people who work at Method. Fred, who works at Method. And so you find this blurring of the lines where Fred, who is a very talented scientist, but most scientists on a brand team are hardly ever seen. They stand in the lab. And Fred is suddenly, he's an ambassador. He's our spokesperson for the day. Written by Nathan with no orchestration from any sort of brand team whatsoever. It's completely, it's like anarchy. But our brand got out that way with no money through efforts like this and things we had absolutely no control over, except that we've done a few things right at the beginning. And we also thought about how people interact with our brand in ways that are often afterthoughts for a lot of companies. So this cartoon was inspired by an actual experience on hold for more than an hour with United Airlines. And as I sat on hold, and I listened to the George Gershwin theme song, for those of you who've flown in the United States and flew United, done it again and again and again, which I can't listen to without my skin crawling. I realized how much they spent on the George Gershwin theme song, how much they spent on every form of advertisement that had gotten me to be part of their program, how much they had spent on frequent flyer miles to make me feel loyal. But the treatment in that call center was all I remembered and inspired me to spend enough time to draw a cartoon and to send it out to everybody I knew. How many of you have seen a video called United Breaks Guitars? Yeah, so there's a musician. He was flying on United. Somebody looked out the window and said, the guys down there on the tarmac are throwing the guitars. And he looked out and saw his guitar, which was precious, being thrown by a luggage handler, falling on the ground. And sure enough, when he got to his destination, it was broken. And he asked United to pay for it. And it started this Kafka-like novel experience for a whole year before finally being told we're not going to pay anything. And so he created a music video with his friends called United Breaks Guitars and played a whole music video. And it's now been seen over 15 million times. And if you go on the Wikipedia for that song, it's partly credited with dropping the United stock price. And so we're all trying as marketers to think about ROI in marketing, and it's very hard to prove this ad created these results. But when you create an experience like that, it actually can have some real impact. And so it's interesting because if you talk to United about customer service, they would probably put it in a cost center bucket, not a profit center bucket. And when you look at things in a cost center bucket, you're looking at cost and whittling down the time that you spend on each call. But imagine how it would be if they were actually remarkable at addressing things when things went wrong. Bad weather happens, but if they had an expert crack team to make it better, that's what you'd remember. Zappos, the brand that's famous for putting customer service on the map, has a contest that they give employees awards for who could stay on the phone the longest with consumers. And the winner is like 6 hours. And you can imagine the cost of a 6-hour phone call. And compared to the revenue from whatever pairs of shoes they managed to sell at the end of a 6-hour phone call. But it became a totem within the organization that everybody who has the opportunity to interact with a consumer views it as a privilege, not as something to be reproduced at all cost. And that flips your whole worldview around. We thought about this a lot at Method, and we had the phone numbers on the bottles would actually ring inside our office. This is Phil. We call him Filthy Phil. And he was our led supply chain for Method. But we had this phone in the corner, and whenever the phone would ring, and we knew it was the consumer phone, we would kind of jockey each other out of the way to answer it, because you didn't know who's going to be on the other end of the line. And suddenly you pick up this phone call, and you have market research, you have a consumer touch point, you have validation of what you're doing, and it's the most immeasurably rich experience in the world. But how often is customer service treated like this versus being put into a call center? It really shaped a lot of what we stood for as a brand, but it's so often overlooked. I ended up on a phone call with Ian Anderson's wife, by coincidence, who just happened to buy a Method product. I could have a Jethro Tull I'm not worthy moment with her. But it showed the value of touching the consumers directly and using as an asset what others often overlooked. And it doesn't have to be a small company that does this. Any business can think about those little touch points on brands and make them into a form of marketing. It just takes people to look for them, which goes back to talent. Is the talent looking for those types of things that could be potentially marketing? Another thing we thought about a lot is, how are we reaching these people and what sort of stories are we telling? Because a lot of brand storytelling is like this. The brand is new and improved now with 50% more claims than the leading brand. Consumers lived happily ever after the end. I like drawing my children in cartoons because they often provide a filter, kind of a filter that all of us, when we have our consumer hats on, see. The stuff that you read it and it's marketing speak, and why would that ever motivate you to do anything? But somehow in an advertisement it's okay. What we try to do was flip that around and actually put things out into the world that had value. And it wasn't ultimately just copywriting. It was ultimately everything that we put out into the world had to be a form of brand storytelling and had to be valuable not only to us because it fit our sense of purpose, but important to the people who received it, who it was a story worth sharing. We wrote books not to advertise, but to actually be useful. We wrote this book called Squeaky Green, and it was a guide to making your home healthier. And the only time it ever mentioned Method or showed a Method product was on the cover. The entire inside of the book was about how to buy a Hoover and how to buy carpets that don't off-gas, those types of things. It didn't say anything about Method, but it stood for our purpose. But as a result, we found these books being shared. And John Lewis wanted to carry it on shelf next to our products. And suddenly people are seeing this book, they like it, and they take it home. And it's point of sale that's actually self-funding because we're putting things into the world that's meaningful to us and meaningful to other people. How many of you have heard of a brand called Beta Brand, or Beta Brand, I guess you would say here? So it's a small San Francisco company, and they launch a new product every single week. And they launch online, but they set this deadline that every single week they have to put something remarkable out into the world, and their whole team gets behind it. One of the big breakthroughs was around Thanksgiving time in the United States. They launched the Gluttony Pants, which you can unbutton buttons from piglet to sow to boar as your meal goes further. But after putting this into the world, a week later, Conan O'Brien was talking about the Gluttony Pants. And you can imagine the response you get with Conan O'Brien mentioning one of your products. They only did that because they did something interesting. Over 1,000 people liked this product and told everybody they knew about it. Stephen Colbert wore some of their trousers, and they launched. There's a lot of news around in the U.S. when they would do airport screenings and were doing video kind of images. Did that make it over here? Images of people when they go through airport screenings, and was making people feel uncomfortable. So they created undergarments that would actually obscure the light and write funny messages on the outside. So every week they do things like that, and people talk about them. And that's what we ultimately tried to do at Method, and I think any business can, is to think about everything you put out into the world as a talk point, as a form of storytelling, whether it's a product or whatever it is. And the thing is, everybody in all of the businesses that we work on, we all have an impact in some way, shape, or form of putting things in the world that people can potentially talk about. But a lot of people don't think about it that way. Design was something that was really important to Method because it was something in our control. And often in design, you have something like this. Don't be polarizing, stay close to the category, show all the benefits, try to appeal to everyone. Now we need to test it to make sure it breaks through the clutter. There's a sense that design is something left to the design department, when in reality, the design of your products is everything that you stand for. And that creates a brand worth talking about. What often gets in the way, and I think this is such a big talent issue, is around silos, that it's not my job, that it's the marketing people's job. No, free range won't work. They're happier in separate pens where they can blame each other when things go wrong. And you end up in this world where everybody is in separate fiefdoms. When I worked at Nestle, our R&D center was a 6-hour drive away. And so the only time we would talk was on the phone, or in the rare moments that we would get together. The rest of the time we didn't talk, and we would throw things over the wall. But everybody in each of these different areas had the ability to impact the brand. And if they're brought into an organization to think that way, it can be incredibly powerful. If they're not, it ends up like a big voodoo doll on ideas, where everybody has the potential to make the idea smaller rather than make the idea bigger. And if you bring the right people, the right talent into the organization, they'll focus on making the idea bigger. We thought at Method that everybody in the organization worked in marketing, no matter what their role. And so the offices looked like this. It's basically one big mosh pit where you have these long tables and no private offices. And you're sitting next to a packaging engineer and across the table from a logistics person, people from all different backgrounds, because we all worked in marketing. Even if you worked in accounting, you worked in marketing. And the ideas and the work were always around us, and we were all finding ways to add to it. And we surrounded ourselves with pictures of everybody in the company, so we knew that ultimately if you were to ask somebody what the brand stood for, it was all of us. It was People Against Dirty, because it was People Against Dirty that said what the brand stood for, and having the right people was so crucial. One of the best things we implemented was having a series of homework assignments. So whenever somebody would want to join Method, we sort of put them through a process. But the process, I think the goal sometimes of recruiting is that you come out of the process feeling more dispirited about the company than you did when you were looking at it. You sort of put the screws on a candidate, and I felt this way at a lot of different interviews where you'd interview, and it was such a painful process that by the end I wasn't even sure if I wanted the job. At Method, we wanted to put people through the paces, but wanted them to feel excited at the end of it. And one of the things that we did was having a homework assignment. I just realized I'm wearing the afro in the corner there. We had 3 standard questions. One of them was a functional question. One of them was a question where we held up that picture of the butterfly bottle, and we asked people, how will you individually make sure that we still get letters and pictures like this? What will you do, even if you're a logistics planner, even if you work in accounting, what will you do personally to make sure we get letters like this? And it removed the obstacle of people saying it's not my job because I don't work in marketing. And that's the worst thing you want to hear, because everybody has the ability to impact. Somebody from a logistics position answered that question by saying, you guys are putting brown corrugate cases with your products in it out to supermarkets. And in the back rooms of the supermarkets, there's stock handlers who are going through them quickly and then putting your products on a cart to then take it up to the shelf and put on the shelf. What if we were to print on the outside of the brown corrugate box a little joke explicitly for the stockkeeper, so it would make them laugh? And then when they go to your shelf, they'll think about you 2 seconds longer to make sure that the bottle's facing the right way out and doesn't look rubbish. What an amazing thing from a logistics person to say. But it costs no money. We're going to print on the outside of the boxes anyway. But when you think about it that way, that even that small interaction can be a form of marketing, it's incredibly powerful. And it transforms how you think about your brand. And we also, we're very conscious about trying to keep it weird, that we wanted people to kind of let their freak flag fly and be themselves when they're in the organization. And how people answered this question was very telling. Because if they're willing to put themselves out there, you can instantly tell after the interview process how they would fit inside our organization. And if they'd be willing to put on a Studio 54 type of wig and go crazy. But it drove what made the Method brand what it is. And here's a bit of a story that came out as a result of that. We had a logistics person in Chicago who was constantly working with a third-party logistics provider on ways that we could be more environmentally friendly. And he just kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And one of these third-party logistics providers said, you know what, we'd be willing to experiment on a route, one route that could be completely fueled from recycled vegetable oil. So a complete biodiesel route, but it's recycled from restaurants. And he finally got to that point, and it was such a big breakthrough. But he started to put his marketing hat on, and he thought, how can we make this even bigger? And he pushed and talked the guys into completely wrapping the truck on that route with graphics that would tell the story about what we were doing and why. And it became this amazing symbol for us as a company that consumers might not see it on the shelf that product was carried by biodiesel, but if they're driving down the route between San Francisco and Los Angeles, they would. And having this amazing lorry painted with these graphics allowed us to think, when an opportunity came along at the Natural Products Expo, which was an event, it's quite expensive to participate in, we couldn't quite afford the booth, we realized we can actually just take the lorry to the front entrance of the Natural Products Expo and then just pay the parking tickets all day long. And so it became the best form of marketing we could ever imagine, because as people are inside the show, walking past every trade show booth and not really paying attention, they literally had to step around this massive oversized lorry in the front entrance. And here's a logistics person turning something that could be a non-event, not only into something remarkable for the company and remarkable from a sustainability point of view, because it now powers 40% of the routes for Method in the United States, but actually a form of marketing as well. Give you another example. So Nicole was one of the first people we hired in the UK, and in her interview question for her job to become a supply chain planner, she said that she thought a marketing opportunity would be interesting to get the Wombles of Wimbledon, which I wasn't as familiar with, involved in Method and do something creative like that. And we thought any logistics person who can talk about the Wombles of Wimbledon sounds like a good fit for us. Little did we know that years later, and in fact this picture was taken after I'd left the company, that she would wind up with the Harlequin rugby team in the shower. It wasn't part of the job description that we sent out. But as it turned out, supply chain planner to brand ambassador, it was a very similar step, and it revolved around a campaign around saving water in the shower and telling people about how much water is used in the shower, and also the fact that we had a daily shower cleaner. But we ultimately ended up with somebody who was a supply chain person with a half-naked Harlequin rugby team. So you never know when you bring somebody in the organization when you're going to ask them to take a shower with the rugby team. But it's something to think about. Are they going to be a brand ambassador for you? How many of you know what this picture is? PC? Yeah, it's actually one of the early Macs. If you were to buy the first Mac and you'd taken off the case, you'd see the signature of every single person who touched the project. Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and the entire team all the way through. And they stamped the plate before they'd shipped a single item. So imagine how you would feel if you were part of that development team and you'd already signed your work before it was on the shelf. How you would think about every single thing you were putting into that project to make sure that it was your best. And I think far too often we don't sign our work in the marketing world, so it becomes something that's detached and impersonal. But when we flip it around and we can make everyone on the expanded team feel like they're part of building a brand, not just filling a seat, it's incredibly powerful and allows you to do incredibly remarkable things. It causes people, when they're looking at an idea, to not commit this type of effect where it slowly gets chipped away, too risky, too different, too provocative, too unconventional, too unfamiliar, too untested, too unfeasible, too expensive. Where's the point of difference? It causes people to think not about chipping tools, but instead about growing tools. How can we make the ideas bigger and stronger? How can we make the ideas a form of marketing that will really resonate with people? It causes people to think about not saying yes but when they're faced with an idea, but saying yes and, because it carries something with them. And when you get your whole organization thinking along those ways, because you have the right people in the organization, because you're making them feel they're driven by a purpose, not just a brand promise, because it's more than just coming in and clocking the timesheet, then you can do incredible things. We had at Method what we called a wiki wall, which every vertical space was covered with a floor-to-ceiling magnetic whiteboard. And rather than brainstorm once a quarter and then come back into an organization and then find ourselves trying to implement it and the ideas getting smaller, we had the ideas always around us. We had 3D printers that let us print bottles overnight so that you could see the next day an idea and add to it. And everybody in the company, accountants, whatever, could pick up a magic marker and add to the idea and make it stronger, because we all saw ourselves as building something that was incredibly powerful. And I think feeling like you're creating when you're inside of an office is so vitally important. One of my favorite stories is an innocent story from a few years. I know you've all seen the Woolly Hats campaign. But I love this as an example of a marketing activity, because you can imagine the very first time this idea was tested. You can imagine testing this idea and going into certain organizations and telling the logistics guy that you're going to have hundreds of thousands of little woolen hats shipped in from all over the country. And the logistics guy would have to open up every box, put a woolen hat on each and every smoothie, and then ship it out to a retailer, one retailer. You can imagine the complexity of that. But these guys had the insight that you can make even a trade promotion a marketing story. And so rather than get 50p off at the shelf, 50p goes to a charity called Age Concern, but you get this smoothie with this amazing little woolen hat on it. What a great story that is. Everybody across the organization had to touch this idea in all of its complexity to make it work out. And in talking with Innocent, they've seen higher lifts on their volume when it's on shelf with a little woolen hat than if they had just given the money to the consumer. So it's a form of marketing that builds a brand, doesn't degrade it with the price promotion, and actually makes the brand stronger. And the only way that's possible is if everybody in that organization sees themselves as part of a common purpose. When I talked with the head of creative yesterday at Innocent, he described Innocent as being made of thousands of nice little touches, which I think is such a wonderful description of a brand, because it means that everybody in the organization has the ability to touch it and add it, make it nice and make it better. And it's the opposite of what happens often, where everyone in the organization is given a cutting tool and makes it stronger and fits into a box. It's a complete mindset change. But even if you're the guy in the middle or the woman in the middle who really believes in an idea and stands behind it, you can bring people onto your side and you can bring people onto your teams and you can motivate a culture so that they step outside of their silos and think about it a different way and do remarkable things. And you can do that within a big company, within a small company. I always think it's remarkable when I look at Unilever that Unilever created a brand like Axe. How does that happen? I mean, they really push the edges of that. They really push the edges in a way that you think that an idea like that, like it or love it, it's an idea that a lot of companies would water down. And they managed to actually keep it strong and powerful and unique. And I met a brand manager last year showing the story of a campaign launch, which was really provocative. It was too provocative even for something that Method would do, very different brands. But I asked him, how did you get this through your legal team? And his answer was that he managed to convince the attorneys that they were helping birth the idea. And they were involved in coming up with something radical. And the attorneys thought about it in such a way from the beginning that they weren't a stage gate to make the idea smaller, but they were part of the marketing team. And I think that's the big idea for all of us, is how do we recruit talent? How do we train talent? How do we leverage talent in a way that HR becomes indistinguishable from marketing? And when we've done that, all of our brands will be a lot stronger, even if we have a big budget to put behind it. So anyway, thank you so much. It's been a real treat.
Does anyone have any questions for Tom?
Axis links, right?
Yes. Oh, I'm glad you said that. Yes. Axis links.
Yeah.
Yes. Sometimes I forget. I haven't been back in the UK for a year, so I've lost some of my lingo.
After all that, what's next? What's your mission?
So I'm looking at ways. So the cartooning started as a hobby, and eventually, for me, turned into a full-time thing. I found myself moonlighting to the point where I could no longer moonlight and do a good job at Method. And so I left in November, and I'm looking at ways that cartoons can be a form of cartoon-based storytelling and content marketing. And so I'm starting to work with other cartoonists who are incredible storytellers and work with them on various campaigns to help work with brands and businesses to communicate better. So a lot of businesses are jumping on Facebook but don't actually have any content we're sharing or content to share. And so I'm developing cartoons that people actually want to pass around that's not shilling their products, but it's instead giving content to their audience in a way they like to get it. So one company I've been working with for over 3 years, which is rare for a marketing campaign to be going on for that length of time, but it's the idea is it just keeps building over time. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Great, thank you. Yes?
So which cartoon have you done which has upset the most people?
Ooh. I did one fairly early on, actually, called the Management Toolkit. And it involved a magic 8-ball and a Ouija board and a few things that the senior managers, I envisioned that they would consult when they were making a decision. And when I sent that out, everyone around me popped their heads up out of the cubicles. It was sort of like the prairie dog. And somebody came around and they were like, you're committing career suicide. You're out of here. And sure enough, a week later, I got an email from the assistant to the chief marketing officer, who was about a bazillion levels above me in the hierarchical organization of General Mills. And I was like, all right. So I started packing my desk like you do and thinking about it. And I went to his office, and he popped out, and he was like, really great to meet you. Saw the cartoon. I thought, this is a guy I have to talk to. Let's go to lunch. And it was only by sending out that cartoon, which everyone thought I'd pushed it too far, was I able to meet the chief marketing officer and ultimately get to know him and ultimately become friends with him. And I think sometimes in organizations, I think we're sometimes scared to stick our neck out, and we think we have to assimilate to do well. And I found a little bit through the cartoons, I had a little bit, doing a cartoon, you can sometimes say things you can't say otherwise. But I found that the more I pushed through the cartoons, the more I stuck my neck out, and actually, ironically, the quicker I advanced in my career, as it turned out. Yeah.
2 questions. What was your role at General Mills, and what was your role at Method?
So at General Mills, I went into their brand management training right out of business school. So I stepped in working on Cheerios, then Yoplait, then Green Giant, as a brand manager, effectively a part of the brand manager team. So General Mills is a great training organization, and learning about how to manage a brand, it was phenomenal for that. And then at Nestle, I was doing similar things. I was the brand manager for Haagen-Dazs ice cream. And at Method, I came in managing the cleaning category in the US, and then I had the chance to, for the first year, I was managing that and moonlighting on our launch in the UK, to the point we got a positive nod from Tesco and Sainsbury's. And then I moved over here, and I left Method as a VP, basically, of marketing, looking after the brand. So it's been mainly brand management jobs, and my early career was startups, tech startups.
Do you live in the UK now?
No, actually, I lived here for about 3 years and moved away 2 years ago to be closer to family in the U.S. And so I headed up international for a while and then took on different roles at Method, and haven't been back here for a year. So it's good to be back.
Very good.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions?
How is
Yeah.
Sorry, another
No, please. Yeah,
before-
love it.
How is Method going to carry on being weird then, in your view, now you've left?
There are a lot of weird people there. Well, I think I was really excited to see the picture of the Harlequin rugby team, because I had no idea that it had happened until I saw it. And I think it all goes to having the right people in the right place, that if you do that, brands can carry on, and it's no longer a product just of the founders. The founders are still at Method. They're still weird. But there are a lot of weird people around them doing weird things, and it's, I think ultimately a brand is measured less by what the founders do directly than the impact that an expanded team can make ultimately by being brought on for the right reasons. Just being an innocent yesterday, it was amazing walking through 6 floors of Fruit Towers and just seeing how well the brand is embodied by all these different people running around.
We haven't got a Coke sign anyway.
No, they don't have a Coke sign, but I imagine a lot of people from Coca-Cola come over in admiration to see what they've done, and I'm amazed. My cartoons are now read by about 100,000 marketers a week, and a lot of the ones that people like the most in the cartoons and the examples I show of cool, funky brands are the big companies who sometimes are painted in a picture of being kind of evil corporations, but actually are composed of people who really want to do the right thing and are inspired by things like that. So I think a lot of companies are inspired by brands like Innocent.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Do you think with a company like Method, there's a size it can get to before it starts to lose what made it so brilliant in the first place?
It's a really good question. I think it's a tricky thing, and I think some of what I've come to understand through the process of seeing Method go from 15 people to 100 people is there are different stages in a business, and different that the brand can evolve over time, and that's okay. And actually, the brand that it was when it was Eric and Adam driving around is not necessarily the brand that you even want it to be today. There are a lot of mistakes were made then, where that bottle with the spout on the bottom, it looked great and it worked great on the counter, but it had the annoying downside of leaking on shelves in Target, 1,400 Target stores across the country, which is not something you want to repeat later on. And so I think that what has to happen is retain the soul as much as you can and the funkiness, while adding a bit more control around making sure that it's done repeatedly. The goal is to be both high touch and high scale. It's a tricky one, and I think there's no clear answer for it except a little bit of what I talked about today, having a purpose that causes people to join for the right reasons, and arming them with the ability to make decisions at the local level where they're trying to make the brand stronger. And going back to Method now, having been gone for 11 months, there are a lot of new people there who have come in for exactly that right reason. They want to make the brand smaller in their area of the world, and continue to see that happen over time. That's a good question. Yeah, thank you.
I think you covered this already in part, but are you approaching your cartoons in the same way that you'd approach your job at your previous company at Method, are you considering yourself a marketer as well as a cartoonist? And what are you doing to market?
Very much so. I think the big thing that I've seen, I started cartooning as a hobby and loved it and never thought I saw a way I could ever make any money at it. And I started to meet all these other cartoonists, and they were talking about the newspapers and the magazines and how difficult it was. And I thought it'll only be a hobby. And what's changed it for me is I suddenly thought, well, what makes me unique is I have this marketing background and I draw cartoons. Can I somehow work with cartoons as a form of media that has value? And if I can do that and wear a marketing hat, then I can effectively, while I may be writing a cartoon series, I'm really creating a marketing campaign. And if I'm doing that, I should think not just about the content in it, but the analytics behind how I'm measuring and how widely it spreads, and creating a cartoon a week for every week for 3 years like I have with that one client. I know how many influencers it reached. I know how far the cartoon spread as a form of media. You know, one of the cartoons was seen over 400,000 times, and if they were to buy media with 400,000 impressions, that would be almost a $20,000 media spend. And so if I can frame cartoons with the media hat on, it can create real value for brands that I work with. And so in making that leap, I guess to answer your question, once I put my marketing hat on as a cartoonist, it suddenly created a business for me. And that's been a lot of fun, is figuring out the lines between that. Because I think there's a lot of opportunity where people are surrounded by clutter, and cartoons are such a wonderful, brilliant medium. You know, brands want so desperately to do better storytelling. And the world's best storytellers in form of these cartoonists are having a really difficult time. And if I can link the cartoons and the marketing, I think that can be really powerful.
Super cool.
Yeah, thank you. Brilliant.
Do you think that there's
Yeah.
an opportunity to put the cartoon mentality into other consumer brands, to bring a little bit of fun into all of our lives in a very dull time?
I do, yeah. I think, you know, one of the things I love about cartoons is that as a medium, there can be a really wide spectrum of what is a cartoon. They don't always have to be funny, they can be poignant. I mean, one of the cartoons I've drawn that had the most meaning to me was on September 11th, the day when nobody really knew what to say, and I drew a cartoon and they ended up using it as the cover of the paper of the school where I went to. It was a poignant cartoon. And it was meaningful to me because I realized that cartoons could really be something rich and powerful. And I think cartoons have this amazing breadth that could be used with it, basically any type of brand. What's wonderful about that is that cartoons in their heyday, people went to the paper to read the cartoons. You know, Hearst, who expanded this newspaper industry in the United States, he had this philosophy that the newspaper with the best cartoons would win whatever city they were in. So they would bring the best cartoons over because they viewed cartoons as loyalty engines. And who else needs loyalty engines but brands? And so if you can create cartoons that don't shill the products, but are cartoons that are about the lives of the people who embrace those brands, they can be communication facilitators. There's a cartoonist named Hugh MacLeod who describes them as social objects. You create a cartoon as a social object, and it creates a medium by which a brand can talk to a consumer in a way that's not seen as marketing. I find that a lot of my cartoons on campaigns that I work on with brands, those cartoons end up framed on the walls of the people who receive the cartoons. And when else would they do that with advertising? Frame and hang it on their wall, advertising from a vendor. So that's what I get excited about, because I think it can be actually quite a broad spectrum. And I'm still a little bit in the pilot phase, but have a number of projects that have been really, really exciting. And I'm particularly excited about bringing on other cartoonists who have different styles and different ways of telling stories than I do, and leverage animation and those kind of things. But it's fun. It's fun to figure out how it works. Thank you. Yeah.
Obviously, you said it in the presentation, social plays a big part of how people influence decisions.
Yes.
I love the idea. If you've got other cartoonists or other people to join in and do a series of cartoons around a brand that, could just spark up ideas and people joining in, it could be a whole viral campaign of different people adding on to ideas that you create around that. That would be fun.
It's a brilliant idea. No, I love the sound of that. I have experimented with cartoons as almost like this totem pole that people want to get around, and I find that on different campaigns, you provide a little bit of incentive for people to jump in. I offer a signed print to one comment every week on my blog, just one, and it's a signed print. It's not a lot, but by doing that, suddenly the commentary around it and people jumping in with their own ideas expands manifold. Or you ask people to do a New Yorker-style caption contest, and they can participate and co-create cartoons. People get really excited about that. And I'm just at the early stages of talking with other cartoonists to figure out how we can collaborate. But there are a few New Yorker cartoonists, and there are cartoonists in the U.S. who used to be in 200 newspapers, the best storytellers ever. and they're having a really tough time because the newspapers are shrinking their comics section so rapidly. And I want to leverage these guys because they may not understand marketing, but they know storytelling. And if you can shape what they're doing in a way that, again, doesn't feel like shilling, but it feels like a real communication, it's really powerful. Yeah. Yes?
Has anyone asked you yet to create a cartoon that represents their personal brand, break through the clutter to help them either get business or get a job?
Very good question. A lot of people use my cartoons on the backs of their business cards, but they're cartoons I've created more generally. I had a cartoon, I didn't show one of these ones, but it showed somebody going through security where their bags are on the ground and they've been forced to disrobe publicly in an airport. And next to it, it says, like us on Facebook, with all the security personnel. And people seem to like cartoons like that because it creates a conversation starter. I have at least 15 different cartoons on the backs of my business cards that when I'm talking with somebody, before I pass it to them, I think which one is most appropriate for them. And I hand that to them side up instead of my logo or anything. So they, oh, love it, and we talk about that. So I think it is a bit like a social object, but I haven't created one for an individual per se. I've created a lot for brands, a brand recently that wanted to launch. It was a completely new brand. And we created a campaign as a way for them to launch. We created a campaign, they're a market research company. We created a campaign all around the making fun of traditional market research. And then they created it, they launched with it, and it was ultimately perceived as content worth sharing. So the leading market research blog is now running it. They're syndicating it, not as ads, but because they want to share the content. And it's helping the spiral effect. So I think cartoons are wonderful for that. Yeah, that's great. Brilliant. Well, good. Well, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it.